All right, well then we will get going. I thought we had just hit the noon hour, but it jumped to 12:01. So welcome everyone. My name is Marc-André Pigeon, and I am the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and this, of course, the traditional homeland of the Métis. As always, we're grateful for the opportunity to work on this land, to share in its bounty and reflect on its beauty, and to reaffirm our commitment to the shared, necessary, and important work of reconciliation, both in the universities and in the cooperative sector. And this is going to be a kind of a theme today. So the timing of today's talk or today's co-op conversation is especially meaningful because it comes on the heels of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I tend to think of this as a time to reflect on the kind of difficult, painful history we have in this country, the trauma that was inflicted on many children and families and communities as a result of those residential schools, and as well as the kind of remarkable resilience of the survivors who sort of made it through. We take a day to kind of think about those things, but we know that reconciliation doesn't just kind of happen in one day. It lives in the kind of choices we make throughout the year. And it kind of heartens me to know that many in the cooperative community have taken this idea to heart and really kind of dug in on, in particular, the TRC Call to Action 92, which calls on corporations to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework, and then to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and or operational activities, particularly those that involve Indigenous peoples and land and resources. This topic is really present in my mind because one of my recent graduate students, Candice Minot, made that call to action number 92 the cornerstone of her thesis, and exploring how two Saskatchewan credit unions went about putting that call to action in motion in their organizations. Now, knowing what I now know about Innovation Federated Credit Union, federal credit unions work in this area, I wish we had worked with Candice and we'd expanded the scope for study to include Dean and the leadership of innovation. But I'm heartened to know that today we're going to have an opportunity to hear from Dean about their journey. I've come to understand that Dean is actually one of the most inspiring leaders I've met in the credit union sector, a big thinker and someone who cares deeply about his Métis heritage and reconciliation more generally, and is just a font of wisdom and knowledge. So with that, I'm going to get to my formal introduction to Dean, then we'll pass things over to him to share his presentation. As I know, Dean Gagné is a member of Saskatchewan's Métis Nation. He's also happens to be or have one of the world's best job titles. He's the Chief Disruption and Growth Officer at Innovation Federal Credit Union. I love that title of disruption in his titles. It gives him license to do fun things. Prior to joining Innovation, Dean had positions as Vice President at Alternate Channels Banking and Chief Research and Strategy Officer at Arcus Group. And I know from speaking to him, he's worked around the world, all over the planet, really. So his experience covers an impressive spectrum of areas, including research, consulting, strategy, technology management, digital marketing, and advertising. So we're delighted to have him here today to share a bit about the journey that Innovation Federal Credit Union's taken with respect to reconciliation. Before I turn things over to Dean, just for those of you who are new, we're going to just briefly run down how things are going to play out today. Dean's going to share his presentation, about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to have a little back and forth, myself and Dean, for maybe 10-15 minutes at most. And then we're going to do a breakout. Now, we always lose a few people at the breakout, and that's fine. People have time constraints and things to do. But if you can stick around, we hear a lot of good things about those informal conversations that happen through the breakout process from our feedback on these events. They're a great way to meet new people, to feel a bit awkward about, newfound acquaintances or reacquaintances if you haven't seen someone for a while. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can message Stan Yu, and Stan's going to wave to folks in a second there. There he is.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And he'll be available to assist. And we're going to be recording this session, and we'll share the link out with anyone who registered for the event. And all of that will be emailed to you later on. So, Dean, with that, I'm going to pass the puck over to you, and we'll get going. Thanks so much.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Excellent.
Okay, just before I share my screen, or share my presentation. I just want to say Tanse. I'm of Cree and European descent, but more specifically the Métis. So there's three recognized under the Constitution of Canada, three distinct Aboriginal groups. One is First Nations and many different First Nations across the country. There's also the Inuit people and the Métis people. And so I'm a combination or an ancestry of Cree and European, but it's important to note that, I saw in some of the history records of my ancestors and they said half breed. Um, but it's not half breed because what defines a Métis nation is the fact that it has its own culture, it has a distinct culture, it has its own language, it has its own customs. And these are all important ingredients in defining it. And I'll explain some of the importance of that as I kind of go through my presentation. So I'm just going to start sharing. Okay, can you see my screen?
It looks great, Dean. Everything's good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so just as we jump in, I just want to share that we're actually just sharing our journey, and everyone will have their own journey. Everyone will have their own strategies associated with that journey, but this is just what innovation is kind of focusing on in its journey along the way. Um, it was brought to you. I'm just trying to advance the slide here, and I'm having issues, Stan. It won't advance the slide.
Dean, can you try clicking on just the screen of the presentation? My understanding is that it should advance if you just click on it. There we are.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure that it's advancing. Okay, it is. Okay, it's on my screen. So as Jean-Marc was sharing, right, we have our own acknowledgement, and I'm coming to you today from Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis. If you look at the nations, there's Cree nations on Treaty 4, there's Saulteaux nations as well. You would think like it would be the Nakota, Dakota, Lakota, right? Nations that are part and parcel of the Assiniboine being the Nakota nations. So I'm coming to you from that territory in the homeland of the Métis. And it's important that when you're going through your journey, you have this recognition of the land, because the importance of the land, and I'm going to explain that in a second, is it's important to acknowledge, through treaties, how treaties were signed and how to think about the land as an important element of the treaties themselves. So you want to keep that in the back of your head as we're going through. But it's really important to acknowledge that they've not been here for centuries. So I've seen, versions where it talks about century, but Indigenous people have been on these lands for millennia. And so they've always been here. And through the process over time, they've shared the land. And it was never the concept with Indigenous people and Indigenous worldview that somebody would own the land. The Creator owns the land, but what the people share the land and they occupy the land, and there's this interrelationship and interconnectedness about the land. And that's important because as some of the concepts that are European, they have a much different view of land. And so it's important. And we want to acknowledge that we live on these lands together, we work on these lands together, and we enjoy the benefits of these lands. But it wasn't the intent originally to actually own the lands. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go through, right? So I've given you some of the background information already, but I want to start with truth and just understanding the concept of truth and what we need to be reflecting and thinking about in the history of how businesses interact with Indigenous people. And it's important that we think about it from the perspective of what's happened to Indigenous people. And then as a result of that, how are we now interacting with Indigenous people and thinking about our interactions with Indigenous people? In some of the building blocks at innovation, you know, some of the things that we recognize in our truth and reconciliation efforts and in our Indigenous Connection Strategy, we talk about 4 key documents throughout history: the Document of Discovery, the Indian Act, the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls to Action. And so a lot of people follow on the very last report, which is Truth and Reconciliation and Call to Action 92. But there's an understanding of the other important elements. And if you remember the last time the Pope came to Canada, there was a movement to get the Pope to renounce the doctrine of discovery. And if you think about it, it was kind of a critical document in that it gave imperial powers to go around the world and expropriate land for their own economic benefit. And so the concept was, if you didn't have a defined culture, if you didn't have defined customs, and if you didn't have a system of government or a system of trade, you didn't have your own language, then you would be deemed savages and therefore you could take it over, which is really interesting because in colonialism, they took over the lands, foreign lands, even though these things were in place and were actually contrary, in fact, to the doctrine of discovery, or reinforced that it was a society. And as you kind of go through and you think about it, the imperial powers through colonialism just basically avoided it. But what was the concept behind it? To acquire, expropriate land, and then to use it for their own economic benefit. And that's the whole concept of colonialism, and it's important. The Indian Act kind of follows that, you know, so if you're trying to get a history of it, it's to understand some of these things where under the Indian Act, Indigenous people were placed on reservations or reserves. And as a result of that, they were restricted in terms of movement, cultural practices, language. And so they were highly dependent on the Indian agent to actually determine what would happen. They couldn't converse with people outside from another nation. They couldn't, you know, under this Indian Act, they also couldn't practice on their own nation, or if they left the nation, they would lose their status. So there's a whole bunch of history around that that's important to realize, that it actually restricts, even to this day, some of the things that can and cannot be done with First Nations on reserved territory. And so it's kind of important to understand that Indian Act and how it impacts modern day thinking about truth and reconciliation, and how we interact with Indigenous people. The call to action 92 is very specific, right? And so when we think about our journey, we really need to think about 3 elements of call to action 92. That is the building relationships, the consultation, and seeking out input from Indigenous people before taking on kind of projects and economic activities with Indigenous people. So it's about the relationship building. It's about the seeking consultation. It's about working with people, Indigenous people, not working against Indigenous people, but how are we involving them in the process itself? The second area is with regard to, I call it meaningful economic participation of Indigenous people in the economy. And that's through jobs, it's through businesses, it's through procurement, it's through a whole bunch of different activities where you're trying to help Indigenous people have meaningful economic participation in the economy. And then the last one is about education. And it's about understanding all the things that have interacted to create the conditions in which we have to deal with today. So those are some key elements that we need to think about in the call to action 92. One of the things that we also need to understand is an Indigenous worldview. And in that Indigenous worldview, I just want to change the thinking. There are many Indigenous worldviews. There's a Cree Indigenous worldview. You know, depending where you are in Turtle Island, there will be different perspectives, but there are some common themes that kind of run through. And so we've based ours on, you know, the nations that we deal with in Saskatchewan in an Indigenous worldview from that perspective, right? But some of the things to think about is about the connections and the relationships. And I'm going to stop here for a second. I was having a conversation with my daughter last night. She's actually doing her master's at Johnson Shoyama, the University of Saskatchewan, but also with Arctic University and Indigenous people in Norway. And she's looking at Indigenous governance. And so we were having a conversation about this very aspect. And there's a Cree word, and it's in Michif as well, which is the Métis language, but it's called Watakowan or Watakowan. But what it means is kinship of being related to one another, kinship and being related to one another. But there's three elements of it that are really important. One is the act of being related, which is important in terms of we're all actively engaged in interconnections, in relationships, and so on. All existence is animate. That's another concept of it, and full of spirit. So the existence that we have today is, you have to think about it beyond just the animate, but you have to think about the spirit. So we're connected in live kind of person, but we're also connected in the spirit realm, and everything is interconnected. Animals and individuals, plants, air, water, it's all interconnected within the universe, and we need to think about that. So when you think about concepts within the Indigenous worldview, like we should be thinking about 7 generations ahead. That's part of thinking about this interconnectedness, that it's not just about making decisions that would positively impact me today, but how do those decisions impact 7 generations down? So we talk about climate, we talk about environment, but in an Indigenous worldview, that's always been there, because the decisions I make today will impact 7 generations down the road. I need to be thinking about that interconnectedness and that interrelationship. But the last part of that concept associated with that word is the whole area of obligations and responsibilities. Because everything is interconnected, that we have an obligation and a responsibility to make sure that we're doing things in a proper way that would then kind of facilitate how we think about it and what we do and the decisions we make. So meaningful economic participation, if we have a responsibility to that, what are we doing and how are we trying to help the environment and the people, the business environment, so that all people benefit, because we're all interconnected. It's not, this is a separate group of people. We are all interconnected together. Common phrase, which I just ran across the other day, is I'm talking to somebody and we have 2 degrees of separation, but we're indirectly related. And the first word that comes up is, "Hey, cousin, how are you doing?" That's the kind of concept that exists within Indigenous communities. And we need to be thinking about that as we formulate strategies and policies for our organizations. When we look at our journey, and our journey began where we have senior leadership, but I would say board and executive leadership as part of that senior leadership. You need commitment on that journey. And so when we began our journey, we went through we hired Vern. Vern is on this call today, but we began back in 2021 and we started formulating it, and we didn't do it in a vacuum. Our executive and board came together. We worked on the strategy together as to how we're going to do that. At one point, what's really interesting is the name of our strategy. There was, bouncing around. It was the Indigenous Accelerator Group. And then I kind of went away one weekend and sat back and thought, no, it's not about Indigenous acceleration. It's about the connectivity and the interrelationships. And so we came up with that as our focus in terms of how we build things out. But then you got into the strategy development after. So the board went through the learning process. So with our executive, the 4 seasons of Truth and Reconciliation offered by First Nations University of Canada. We did the blanket exercise. We had lots of conversations and consultations and presentations from various Indigenous groups. And we formulated our strategy. And quite frankly, our strategy is evolving. It's not static. It's not set in stone, but it constantly evolves, and we measure our progress against it. Now, here's one of the initial diagrams that we kind of went through. And that was when we did this kind of mind mapping. We talked about all the different relationships and even our internal business units in terms of how we look at it, whether it's financial institutions, IFIs, Indigenous financial institutions, but we looked at, other credit unions, and there's it started out as a Métis credit union in Manitoba. How do we work with them? We looked at Métis groups, we looked at First Nations groups, we looked at locations, we looked at other co-ops as to how we could work together. We looked at different universities for education, as well as the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology. How do we work with them in a holistic manner? And we had Vern as an advisor, but we also a former chief and vice chief of the Meadow Lake Tribal Council, but also the Birch Narrows Dene Nation was Eric Sylvester. And so with Eric, we still use Eric as kind of a guide and an advisor as we move forward to this day. We have broken out our strategy in several components, right? The foundational pieces of our strategy, which is internal to Innovation Federal Credit Union, we look at Indigenous culture and awareness, and we support those activities. We support the education. We support our people in being involved in Indigenous cultural activities. That's kind of a foundational piece. And everybody has to go through the 4 seasons of truth and reconciliation. And we look at Indigenous employment. So if we're going to have meaningful economic participation as part of it, then we better be measuring. Right now, we're just shy of, or around 6% of our workforce is Indigenous. Our goal is in Saskatchewan to get it up to 16 to 17% to be reflective of the economy as a whole. The other one is Indigenous procurement is important. When you think about procurement, the government of Canada has 5% of its procurement related to sourcing from Indigenous business, whether goods and services. That's extended to in provincial arena, and is also municipalities have also extended it. But the real question is, even though the government is doing it, what are we doing? So you think about simple ways, or as one Indigenous ECDEV company CEO told me, he said, we look for ways to help non-Indigenous businesses and individuals press the easy button. So, where do we stay at when we stay at hotels? Do we stay at Indigenous owned hotels, or do we stay at another hotel? When we buy our coffee, are we buying our coffee from an Indigenous business or not? So we need to kind of do some self-reflection. The middle part is in there, which is call to action 92, the first point, which is approach to building relationships. So, we have concern for the community, and we have an Indigenous development fund. So our board has allocated $1 million over 10 years. So we spend $100,000 per year strictly for Indigenous related. We also take 2 to 4% of pre-tax profits, and that percentage within that amount that's allocated also has an Indigenous component to it. So we're saying we should be spending between 15 to 20% of those monies on Indigenous activities as well. So it's there. But I'll tell you this, the key is building relationships at a grassroots level with all the nations and with all the various Indigenous organizations. It's through those relationships that things happen. And that we've noted is really critical to everything we do. Is we build, we make connections. Through those connections, we get input and advice from those various entities and organizations, but all with the benefit of Indigenous people. So we look to have a win for the nation, a win for the people of the nation, and a win for innovation and partners as we're dealing with this. And that gets into the top part is when we do the partnerships and build it, it has a natural connection to our own kind of business. And when we look at it, how do we help nations source funds? How do we help nations with capital projects on the nation? How do we work with, let's say, Métis organizations or other IFIs to help support their, financing of Indigenous companies? So we look at the impact from a business point of view, but from a consumer banking point of view, we also want to make sure that the people on the nation are getting the identities. We're setting up our internal policies and practices to make it easy for them to open accounts. And then there's a whole area of financial literacy. We don't call it financial literacy, we call it financial empowerment. Because financial literacy really has the connotation of, I'm going to tell you what you need to know about finances, as opposed to, we want to work with you to empower you to be able to deal with your finances in a way that's meaningful to you. So it's a slightly different approach. And then we have a diversified banking group, which we have like the mutual benefit. How do we help nations get the resources they need to develop their own economic independence? So these are just these additional slides I went through. I'll provide the deck. I don't want to get into them because I just described them in general. So I won't go there, but I just want to kind of end with this slide. And this is when we work with First Nations in particular, what we do is monies that have been owed to them by the government of Canada, we help accelerate that. We finance claim settlements. So we help the First Nations as they're setting it up. We help them get the individuals that can help accelerate the claim settlement process for them to put them together, whether it's insurers, whether it's individuals helping make the claim against the government, whether it's lawyers. We help in that, and we don't have a direct benefit from that, but we do benefit, and this is where I get back, a win for the nation, a win for the people of the nation, and a win for Innovation Federal Credit Union and partners. We work with them. When the government does agree to make a settlement, they usually take their time in paying the settlement. So what we've done is we've helped create bridging loans for the nations to get access to the money earlier so that they can start doing capital projects or programs on nation, extension to a school. It could be many things, or it could be down to their economic development corporation to help buy companies that would then participate in the procurement policies of the governments of Canada, the provincial governments and the municipal governments, as well as corporate Canada. So we try to find ways to assist them to speed up the process. We help them deal with legacy trusts. A lot of these were set up by in incestuous nature with the banks. So they're the trustee, they're the investment manager, and they lend against the trust. But in a lot of cases, they're exploiting the nations themselves. So we work with them to look at their trust and maybe to restructure their trust so that they can get more out of their trust. The other thing within the trust side, we're looking is capital preservation within the trust so that the trust doesn't get spent by one generation, but the trust is there for 7 generations. So it's helping them think about trust and how they set up trust, how they manage trust. So there's information, or there's the preservation of the capital for future generations. Then the other thing is the existing legacy trust. So this is setting up a new trust from a claim, but there's also the legacy trust. So reviewing those trusts and what can be done with an existing trust, and how can they leverage it so there's more benefit to the nation itself. And then we also do financing and helping set up bank accounts. So one of the things that we do, we go on nation. We actually do the setting up of the accounts right on nation. We help them get ID because oftentimes they don't have valid ID. So we help them get the ID. We do work in the schools with them. We have an active part of our summer student program. 30% of our summer students this year were Indigenous. And one of the things we want to do is, if you're going to change the 6% to get to the 16 or 17%, you need to have more Indigenous people at the beginning of the funnel. And so we're looking for ways to work with First Nations University, the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology, to find other ways where we can come up with co-op programs or internships, different ways that we can do things to accelerate the talent pool, whether we get it or not. So one of the things that we use as kind of our indicator, whether they come to work for innovation or not, isn't the purpose of why we're doing it. It's they should be able to work in the financial services industry. And we see that as a long-term benefit, because what happens if they become, let's say, the financial administrator, or they become the controller, or they become the chief financial officer of the nation itself? We help get them there. And so we see that as a long-term benefit, that we might not reap benefits, but we're trying to position the nations and innovation to get to that point. The my last slide here is in closing. Here's some key points, I think, key takeaways, right? Reconciliation has to come from the top, and it has to come from the board and the executive team. There has to be that commitment, and it shouldn't be a checklist like, hey, we're doing truth and reconciliation. It has to come from the heart. And in doing that, you want to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. We think the benefits will follow, but we're still doing it no matter if the benefits come or not, because it's the right thing to do. And so I think that that's important, but you need that support at the top. Otherwise, it's just going to be a token program. You know, and you'll hear concepts like rent a feather. You'll hear other kind of concepts where I'm a token and Indigenous employee. If it's coming from the top and it's coming from the heart, those kinds of concepts are not going to evolve and come forward. You need to involve Indigenous people in the journey. When we go to northern communities, for example, we usually meet with Indigenous leaders, the mayor and council, right? So in the Métis community up north, that's how we first came about setting up a micro advice center within a co-op in Isle La Crosse, Saskatchewan. We actually met with the people and said, what are your needs? And what are you looking for? And how can we come alongside and assist you in achieving the things that you want to achieve for your community? So I think that external relationship building and input is critical. Also, at all levels. At innovation, one of our directors is First Nation. I sit on our executive team and I'm Métis. But you should be looking at Indigenous representation throughout your organization and involvement, but also across functions. So, like, is your retail operations, how many of those individuals are Indigenous? And then you should be looking at each division, your technology group or your people division or whatever the division is. How diversified and how engaged are each of these groups within your Indigenous journey? It's got to be, as I said on point 3, it's got to be a win for the nation, or the Métis Nation, or whether it's a First Nation, or whether it's an Inuit group, right? That there needs to be the philosophy has to be, it has to be a win for them. It has to be a win for their people. And then it also has to make sense from your own organization's point of view. So I think it can happen. I think there's lots of opportunity. And when you're thinking about this, we're doing this, right? This is our journey, and I'm just sharing our journey. But think about how you and your organization can come along with us, right? So we're sharing this, but if you see fit, you can reach out to us and we can share journeys back and forth. Lessons learned, things that we can do together. So we work with many different entities across Canada in actually working to advance Indigenous issues across the country. So if you want to reach out to me, you can do it. But my last comment here is your takeaway. Think about where you personally and where your organization is on its reconciliation journey. And I didn't just say your organization, but what about you? Do you have Indigenous friends? Have you, if you went to Indigenous events, do you really understand Indigenous worldview? Do you have somebody that can guide you in understanding that Indigenous worldview and how people see the world differently? Because Indigenous people do see the world different from a European point of view, or depending on where you came from in the world, you'll be influenced by your worldview. And so how does that relate? Because at the end of the day, there's Indigenous people who have shared the land in Canada and in the US and in Mexico, have shared the lands with others to come. And it shouldn't be one group exploits another group. That's the whole basis of colonialism. But what we should be asking ourselves, how do we work together so that all people can live on, work on, and share the benefits of the lands? That was the intent of the treaties, and that we'd all coexist. We'd all be interrelated, interconnected, but one wouldn't dominate over another. You know, the story of the two canoes going down a river. We can both be on the river. We can be headed in the same direction, but we're in our, each of us is in our own canoe and guiding our direction, right? So the Iroquois had mentioned that in some of their sharing and story. And at the end, I'm just going to leave you with one story. I have a good friend for 25 years, and his name's Jerry Nelson, and Jerry would be fine with me sharing. He's from George Gordon First Nation. He was a 60 scoop baby, so they took him away from his parents when he was a kid, and they placed him in non-Indigenous foster care homes. And Jerry had a pretty rough upbringing, but eventually Jerry got into into policing and became part and parcel of the policing. And so Jerry and I were having a conversation about how do we get Indigenous, more Indigenous people employed and working within the economy. And so Jerry shared a story with me, and I'm going to share that story with you. There's a forest fire in the north, and there's a hummingbird, and a hummingbird takes some water in its mouth, and it flies to the fire, and it spits on the fire, and then flies back, gets another mouth of water, and flies back and spits on the water. And in his journey, there's a cougar sitting on, or a mountain lion sitting on the floor of the forest. And he's watching this, and then eventually he stops the hummingbird and says to the hummingbird, "What are you doing?" And the hummingbird says to him, "Well, I'm getting water and I'm spitting it on the fire." And so he goes back and he continues, and then he comes back, and then all of a sudden the cougar stops him again. But you're not going to make a difference with what you're doing. And then the hummingbird continues, and then one point the hummingbird comes back and stops in front of the cougar and says, "Just so you know, I'm doing what I can do," and then continues on, right? And so the pact that Jerry and I made is, we're hummingbirds, but we're part of the hummingbird pack. Maybe we won't change the world, but we're doing what we can do. And so I think that's important when we think about, our journeys, where we're at in our journeys, and what we can do to make a difference for the Indigenous people who have been exploited for centuries. What can we do to make a difference in their lives to bring them equally participating in the economic realities of modern day Canada? So with that, I'm just going to stop and stop sharing my presentation. Did it stop, or did I lose you?
You're clear. You're clear.
Okay.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. So really powerful, and I love the story at the end, especially in this day and age where people might feel a little sense of hopelessness. That sense of just doing what you can do is a really powerful message. And there's so much that I want to pick up on here, Dean, but I also want to make sure we do what we do, which is we try to work on building those relationships through our breakout. And that's an important, as you were emphasizing the importance of that, I thought we really need to kind of jump to that and give people a few minutes to kind of connect, and then we can come back and have a plenary conversation. So if I ask Stan to shunt us off for 10 minutes, Stan, we'll come back at 12:50. And if you're, as you break out into your groups, for those of you who stick around, if you don't know people, just introduce yourself. If you do know each other, well, that's great. And we're going to ask you to think about a couple of questions that Dean shared with us. So where is your organization in its truth and reconciliation journey, and where are you individually in your truth and reconciliation journey? So those are the two things we're asking you to share in this discussion group. And then we'll come back, and then we can maybe take from that and maybe ask questions of Dean and just have a general conversation. So Stan, please break us out 10 minutes, and we'll see you soon. Okay, I'm going to throw a question on the table, Dean, because I have like many. But one of the things that I keep thinking about, Dean, in the context of a credit union, you have like this powerful economic engine. You know, they can do a lot with a credit union, right, as an economic tool. But I'm also thinking about the kind of the fraught history of like money and colonization, and like I think of the Métis script, or the problems with taking security on reserve land, all these kinds of things where money has often been a tool of power and kind of marginalization. Like, how do you think about that in terms of what you're doing at Innovation Federal Credit Union, and then also your cooperative structure? Like, where does that all kind of land for you, especially as the person of the Métis Nation?
Yeah. Well, from the Métis Nation, I'm actually a script person, right?
Okay.
So right after the Battle of Batoche, my family were all along the North Saskatchewan River at Duck Lake, just outside of Duck Lake at Fort Carlton. In fact, it was my great grandfather to the sixth that set up the Carlton House, which was a trading house, which eventually became Fort Carlton. But one of the things that I would think about, and I'm going to kind of focus my discussion right now, particularly around First Nations, because First Nations really received, in my mind, the brunt of, let's say, the Indian Act, where they were put on reservations and they weren't allowed to interact, and they were really controlled and restricted, right? And even to this day, there are still laws under the Indian Act that impact them individually. But I would say one of the things is this. I once heard a son of a chief from BC, and he wrote a book called Dancing with Dependency. And one of the things that I look at in terms of the forward thinking nations, um, and the nations that we've dealt with, so Dakota Whitecap, I think of other nations like English River, Dene Nation, where they have their ECDEV. They have 26, 27 companies under their ECDEV now. If you look at the Kitsaki group under the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, which is doing really well, and there's many cases where there's there. But one of the things with it is reducing dependency on the government, right?
Mm.
And so what we see as a critical component is helping accelerate the monies owed to nations from the government of Canada. So we do a lot of work with various Indigenous groups and with lawyers to try to accelerate the claim settlement processes, right? Because one of the issues that First Nations have is they've always been dependent on the government. And so if you look at housing as an example, because you brought it up, housing becomes an issue because the government restricts the amount of funds that are transferred to a First Nations for housing development. So as I talked to one chief in particular, they have to make a decision. Do I fix the houses on the First Nation, or do I build new houses? Because if I build a couple of new houses, I can't do both. I don't have the funds. Where we're seeing a change is when they get economic development, they're able to tackle some of these issues. Then they're able to use, the trust, for example, as security, and they're able to use deposits
Mm.
to help finance additional financing. So we're looking right now. We haven't got the answer, and I'm not going to try to lead you to believe that we do. But one of the things that we see is there's going to be an accelerated growth in housing by individual First Nation and Métis people. Because they have access to capital and security so that they can get into houses. This then alleviates the pressure. So in a lot of cases with First Nations, if I can build a house, I get the tax benefits if I'm on reserve. And so what we're trying to do is figure out ways as to how we can make this work. How can we do it in such a way that they can accelerate the group so they take people out of the queue who can afford to be out of the queue, who now live off reserve, but would live on reserve if they could get the benefits, but also rethinking how you do it. So just like on provincial government land, right? If you're at a park or a national park, you lease land, right? So there's other structures in place that you could utilize to approach it in a very similar way, because you could never own the land because the land is owned by the nation itself, right? But are there other mechanisms that we should be employing, but working with the nations to come up with them?
Right.
Chances are they've thought about this, right?
Right.
And how do
That's
we fit within their development plans?
I feel like we could have a whole separate conversation about finance and reconciliation like that, just narrowly on that theme. That would be a lot of fun and important. I had a question from Laura. I'm going to pass the mic to Laura. Do you want to jump in, Laura? Your question?
Hello. Yes, I'm a Master's of Public Policy student, and I'm doing my research on colonial timber trade, basically. But a lot of that actually comes from the weaponization of access to finances and monetary means. Essentially, a lot of Canadians' lumber industry was built on Indigenous backs, and most of our timber was stolen from the reserves to build CPR and CN. And just this interesting contrast between now and uh, I guess even before the Indian Act, of how finances control resources and anything, and the change between how that's been shifted through the last 100 years, essentially, that this provides a way to avert the scars, essentially, that the Indian Act and colonization has affected Indigenous people.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the forestry side is an area that I have expertise in, but I can share with you that my dad worked with the 8 Dene Nations in northern BC, and he helped negotiate a, a settlement on forestry with the government of Canada, right? So he was actively involved in negotiating on behalf of those 8 Dene Nations, right? And what it was and once again, I'd mentioned treaties, right, and treaty land and so on, but there's treaty land and then there's unceded territories, and so there's many nations that never did come to an agreement with the government of Canada, right? So the way it kind of opens a door to new agreements and new settlements that can be done. It's just that those agreements and settlements have to be structured in such a way that it's a win for those nations, the people of those nations, the government of Canada, and let's say the forestry companies, right? So, how can you go about it in such a way that the agreement is not exploitative and it's one way, but how do you negotiate it? And I think another one would be the Cree Nations with the James Bay project, right? As another example, where the government of Quebec, the government of Canada, and those I think it was 16 or 17 nations, Cree Nations, they came to an agreement as to how these lands and how the benefits would be, right? So I think if you have the right spirit in the negotiations, you can kind of in a way you can unwrite some of history and do the corrections, but approach them in the right meaningful way in the first place, right? That would be how you avoid this. That I think you have to be thinking about it. The government tends to be very uh, kind of strict, almost to the letter of the law, and what we're seeing in some of it when it comes to treaties, right? And I'd say if there's one thing that society can do to change government perspectives is is to really get government to think about the relationships they have with Indigenous people moving forward, right? I think it's been a very one way, very standoffish. I don't really want to give you something because it might set a precedent for something else, as opposed to saying Canada has benefited, since Confederation at the and even before Confederation, by exploiting the resources and the lands that Indigenous people shared. And so, to me, I think there's an advocacy. One of our directors who's going to step down. One of the things he challenged us to think about as an organization: how can we be part of the advocacy on behalf of Indigenous people to speed up some of the things? Because what we see typically, the government stalls, right? They only do it when the court orders them to do it, and even then they take their sweet time in getting stuff done. So I think as society we need to think about how can we play an advocacy role for, as I'm Indigenous, but non-Indigenous people playing an advocacy role to accelerate the issues that have been identified that Indigenous people need to have dealt with.
Thank you so much, Dean. Hopes are good.
I don't know if that specifically answered your question, but part of the problem is I get on a tangent. That's my natural Métis way, right?
Well, I love it, Dean. I've seen you in action, and it's always fun. There's always so much insight flowing from you. Listen, we're at time. I want to thank everyone, but especially Dean for the sharing. This conversation lives on because we're going to post this to our YouTube channel. We're going to share the link out, and in some small way, that might help with that advocacy conversation we were just talking about. So we'll be sending that recording out very soon. I just want to flag that our next co-op conversation, always the first Wednesday of every month, is going to feature Dr. Coralie Darcy, who's going to talk about the Saskatoon Community Clinic, which is a remarkable, successful primary care clinic, a true Saskatchewan success story, anchored in the cooperative model that does wonderful things for actually a huge Indigenous population in the core neighborhoods of Saskatoon. Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. There's a nice linkage back to what Dean was talking about today. So we'll hopefully see you next month. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and especially Dean, for joining us today. And we hope to see you again in future co-op conversations. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.